success, wealth, recognition. Gary Cooper had it all, lost it all, then turned a revolutionary discovery into the success paradox. Here's Gary.
As a survivor of the miracle in the Hudson, Billy Campbell learned the value of gratitude and fragility in life. He embodies resilience, adaptability, and the importance of following your passions. With 4 decades of experience in show business and leadership roles at ABC, Warner Brothers, and Discovery Networks, Billy continues to thrive. He's now a consultant for multimedia companies and a partner on the new television network called Growing Bolder. Billy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Gary. It's a privilege to be with you, and I'm very excited to share a little bit of my life and beliefs, and I'm very much inspired by your story. And, it's amazing that you and I have sort of seen each other a number of times down here, but we interestingly ran into each other most recently at a friend's funeral and started to catch up that way. And that's how I learned about what you're doing. So I'm really glad to be here today.
Well, I appreciate you being here, Billy. You know, we talked about inspiring other people when we were at the funeral, and seeing you at a funeral of one of my family friends. She worked with my family, I think, right at 50 years. And seeing you there was really cool. And, I talked to you about the book that I was doing, hopefully to help others. And it was just automatic. Like, Billy, would you mind sharing your story about not only about the flight, but, living in Pawleys Island, Litchfield area, we have a pretty eclectic community, very successful people like you, my neighbor, the former CEO of AutoZone, Cokie Roberts, lived here for a long time, Ollie North. And then we have people like me and you that just grew up here and grew up in South Carolina. And if you don't mind, I'd like to start there, our humble beginnings.
Sure.
How did you get from South Carolina, from where you were? And I was listening to one of your other interviews and the 2 amazing roommates that you had at Harvard. How does a small town South Carolina boy get to Harvard, get to those amazing roommates? I mean, that's a story in itself.
Well, I think it is. It's a fun story. And probably like you, sometimes I, pinch myself and wonder how did I sort of get there? How did that track happen? And I think a lot of it happened because of the way that I was raised. My dad was in the textile business. And so I grew up in switched schools about every 4 years. I lived in Greensboro. Then in 4th grade, we moved to Charlotte. And then I'll never forget when we were at dinner after the 8th grade, my mom at dinner said, well, your dad has gotten a promotion and we're moving to Greenville, South Carolina. And Gary, being a South Carolinian, you know that people in North Carolina sometimes look down their nose a little bit at South Carolinians. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't, but they do sometimes. And I probably was a little bit like that and saying, wait a minute, I'm living in Charlotte, getting ready to go into high school, play sports with all my buddies, and I have to move to Greenville. Now, the only big advantage immediately, if you remember, was when, way back, South Carolina you were able to get your driver's license at 15. So all my friends were, even though I didn't want to move at that time, they were envious because I was going to be driving a year ahead. But I remember coming down and we moved to Greenville and I went to Christ Church Episcopal School, which has had a major role in my life. And I got there, didn't know anyone, but the one thing that I did have was I loved sports, and I played football, basketball, and baseball all through high school. And so I immediately had friends on my first day moving there because I was in football practice. But I think that to go back, you mentioned something about the Harvard thing, and I hadn't thought about this in a long time, but some people used to say, why did you go to Harvard? Or how did you even think of going to Harvard? And I was the first kid from Christ Church to go to Harvard. So it was a little bit uncharted territory. But for me, it all happened really when I was probably in the 4th or 5th grade living in Charlotte. And one of my best friend's brothers had gone from Charlotte and was a freshman at Harvard. And he really had always kind of been nice to me and taken me under his wing a little bit. And I remember he sent me a Harvard t-shirt during his freshman year. And of course, I wore it all the time. And I think I probably wore it for about 15 years. But I always, just for some reason in my back of my mind, I thought, you know what? I've heard and I've read that Harvard's the best school. So that's where I want to go. And the key to answering your question is that both my parents, but especially my mom, always believed in me and never, ever said, that's a crazy idea, or why would you want to do that? So when senior year rolled around, I applied to Harvard and I applied to Clemson, where my dad went. And really, I know where your heart is too. We're big Clemson fans. And interestingly, I got into Harvard early action, and Clemson didn't accept me until, I think, April or May. And I remember my dad loving to tell the story that he said, thank goodness, Clemson still thoroughly reviews all their applicants. So that was a wonderful sort of, story that I've told. But when I went to Harvard, so when I decided that I was accepted and I decided I'm going to go, I was one of I think 3 or 4 kids from the whole state of South Carolina to go to Harvard. I didn't know anyone when I got there. And boy, speaking of the low country part of us, I was so homesick. I remember when I got there the first day, I flew Eastern Airlines up there, which doesn't exist anymore. They took me into the Harvard Yard where all the freshmen live, and the policeman directing me to where I needed to go could not understand my accent. So I had to finally show him the piece of paper, and he kind of goes, oh, this is where you're going, Wigglesworth I entry. And of course, as Southerners, we have a little bit of tough time with that letter I. We shorten it just a little bit. But that was kind of the beginning of me getting there and realizing that, boy, you almost could have just planted me on another planet. They didn't have sweet tea. They didn't play beach music. All the stuff that I'd grown up with, the food my mom would cook, was just alien. But I played basketball, and that got me in. I was on the basketball team, and that got me in with another group of guys. So sports has been sort of a fun thing. But anyway, long answer to your short question about how the Harvard thing. But again, I wanted to emphasize, I think it's so important for parents to support, their children. And I remember on your podcast, you spent a little bit of time talking about social media. That's a whole nother sort of topic. I gave a talk recently to Christ Church, and I did talk to all the students there, about 1,000 students. And one of the things I focused on was social media has so much positive opportunity and so much power, but it also does have sort of this evil side. And I also think it's almost like a suction that really kind of magnetically pulls kids in. And I don't know if you see it, Gary, but I see all the time that kids today struggle a little bit sometimes with representing themselves verbally because they're so used to this texting thing. And the grammatical parts are things that I worry about a little bit, and also interviews. So I don't know. I love the fact that my mom, who's from Andrews and a Hemingway, grew up and really taught me that, the most important things in life are not things. The most important things are be nice to people, care about people. And I think I love the part about being Southerners because we love to tell stories and sort of pass along things. And that kind of led me into when I ended up doing the entertainment. One of the things that I think I loved the most about landing out there was I got to learn to work with people that told stories, and I got to sort of help craft that.
There's so much goodness in that story. One of the pieces that I'm just kind of picking out, it's almost like a bouquet of flowers, and I'm just going to pick out 1 or 2 of them. One of them is, the influence that our parents have on us. One of them is the power of positive thinking that I know you talk about. And one of them is going to be in your talk in a little bit, is the power of coincidence. Your friend sent you that T-shirt. That could have been a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. You certainly have had a different life than you would have had if you went to Clemson. And so what has the power of positive thinking done for you? Whether that goes all the way back to your sports. Sports has obviously been a big thing for you. This could be for parents out there. I'm a parent of 4 kids. This could be for kids. This could be for someone like you and I have been talking about, anybody who's struggling. How has positive thinking been just a core thread in your life from your sports, your career, and certainly in the story that you're going to share with us in a little bit about surviving Flight 1549?
Well, you were saying something about the bouquet of of things to pick from my story, but I think I'll flip it on you. Your question is really the bouquet of letting me tell just a couple of stories. You had alluded to one earlier, and I think on the positive thinking part, but also really the part about serendipity and coincidence, and the role it plays in our lives. And so let me give you two examples. So in college, freshman year, they assign you roommates. And so I had a roommate from Colorado Springs and a roommate from Plainville, Connecticut. Wonderful guys, and I love them, and I'm still friendly. Saw them at my reunion last year. As I went along during the year, I met a couple of other guys that we had a little more in common, and I thought would be great roommates. And I got so lucky. And so these two guys did know each other when they came, and they were my roommates for sophomore, junior, and senior year. And believe it or not, both of them were pre-med. They were from Wilmington, Delaware, and one was who is now Dr. Thomas D'Amico, and he is now the head of lung cancer surgery at Duke University. And the other roommate that you and I have probably chuckled about a little bit, who was, believe it or not, years ago, a top, and I mean internationally top cardiothoracic surgeon at Columbia Pres in New York, was Dr. Mehmet Oz. So those were my college roommates. And so I got really lucky being, this kid from South Carolina and meeting these two guys from Wilmington, Delaware, that really changed my life because we've all been lifelong friends. Now, being an entertainment guy, you'll get a kick out of this. I used to love to be at an event, whether it be a speech or a meeting with people or friends or whatever. And I always throw my arms around these two guys. Have them on each side. And I'd say, thank goodness one of us is giving back to society as a television guy. Okay. And so they loved that. I just thought that was the funniest thing because I was always fascinated by their world about saving people. And by the way, a lot of what you do with Palmetto Infusion and making people's lives better. But again, I was willing, I sort of stepped out of my comfort zone, ended up having lifelong great friends and roommates who are both really accomplished guys. And one thing that both of them, to come back to your question on positive thinking, that they both told me when I was preparing a talk a couple years ago for Miami Cancer Center I spent some time in Miami, and I was talking to the Miami Cancer Center, and it's the power, and they haven't completely quantified it. You've probably seen it with what you do, but there's this unbelievable connection between how well patients do coming out of surgery and dealing with rehab when they are positive thinkers. And that's not only themselves, but also their support team. And so that's something that I've never forgotten. I also think in terms of sports, and you're right, I've played a lot. The lessons that I learned in sports were, one, always you're going to have tough days, or you're going to have tough plays, or sometimes tough weeks or months, whether it be an injury or someone's better than you or whatever, you don't play quite as well. And what I've learned is you pick yourself up. And it's always that adage about it's not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get up and dust yourself off. And the other thing I think that we have to all learn in life, not just in sports, but it permeates all of our lives, is you learn to compete. And that's whether it's every day in business, or it's learning to compete fairly, whether it's international things that I do. But one other quick story before I come back to you is that I think is really important, and it's partly positive thinking, but it's also goes back to the going to Harvard. Is I tell young kids today, be willing to raise your hand. And so what does that really mean? Well, when I was in business school my second year, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do something interesting. I had worked right after college on Wall Street, and that really wasn't my calling. I thought I wanted to do something that might involve, making something or a product, but I wasn't sure. Well, I went to class, and the CEO, it was a marketing class, and the CEO of ABC Entertainment Television came to our class to talk, and this was at Harvard Business School. And after class, he was fascinating, telling stories about the case we had that day. But after class, everyone left. But he was just standing there. And so I walked up to him, thanked him for coming to the class, and I asked him a couple of questions. It was another 20 minutes before he had the next class. So we had about 10 or 15 minutes together. And through that conversation, by the end, I asked him, I said, why aren't you recruiting here? And he laughed and said, you know what, Billy, we've just gone through this acquisition where we acquired ABC. So not only are we not hiring, but we're firing as quickly as we can. And what he really meant was they were downsizing. But I sort of said, oh, well, that answers my question. And he looked at me and he said, no, we're always looking for good people. and you seem to know a lot about our company. Why don't you send me a letter and a resume, and let's just see what happens? So I went back to the room, hand wrote him a letter, resume, put it in the mailbox. And Gary, 2 days later, his office called and invited me to come have lunch with him in New York City. So I flew down about 3 days after having met him. At lunch, he said, we've just acquired ABC. We need someone to help us understand programming. Would you be willing to move out to Los Angeles and learn TV programming for us and be our liaison? And again, it was kind of that Harvard moment, which is, well, I've never thought about doing that. No one's from South Carolina has really kind of been out there doing that. I said, absolutely, let's go. What's the worst that can happen? I was working for a great company and it was an adventure. And I got there, and that's when the storytelling part really sort of hit me in my DNA, is that I loved working with people that were creative and telling stories. And I ended up spending about 25 years out there at the various companies you mentioned. But again, I think part of that is positive thinking, which is some people feel like, oh, I don't quite know what to do, or I'm not sure what's next.
I'm not ready.
My view is, you know what? There's this spectrum. Sometimes it's invisible, but there are opportunities that are coming by all day, every day for all of us. And all you have to do is kind of reach for it. I don't know if you're about, I think we're kind of close to the same age. You're a little bit younger, but I used to use an analogy, and I said, reach for the brass ring. And when I was at a speech about 5 years ago, a couple of young kids came up to me after and said, what is the brass ring? And so I had to sort of revamp the way that I kind of explained that. I remember when we grew up, you'd do that on the carousel. You'd reach out and you'd have to be willing to take a lunge. But what it really means is be willing to step out of your comfort zone and be willing to try something. And I think I learned it at Discovery. My favorite word when I'm looking to hire someone or spend time with someone is are they curious? And if they're curious, because I consider myself curious, then you know what? I know that we're going to have something in common and we're going to be able to learn from each other.
To me, that's where the magic is. What you just described is one of my questions I had for you was, can anyone do what you did? I'm talking career-wise. I'm not talking about the miracle, but can anyone leave a small country town? It could be the Midwest. It could be Canada. It could be anywhere in the world. A small town in England and move to London and do it. Can anyone do it? You just described how you do it.
Yeah, and I think the answer is just the personification from me is yes. Does it mean that it'll always work, or there's a set path to follow or a set of instructions? No. But again, Gary, I think it's being willing, having passions, being willing to be open. Honestly, the reason that I got that first job was because I was curious. Everyone else left. I wanted to say thank you, but I also was curious to ask him a few questions. And the next thing you know, it led to sort of a door opening. And as we all know, doors, windows, whatever, the good Lord opens those for us sometimes. Sometimes you just have to be willing to jump through that door. And I think for me, I've never been fearful of that. It's like, what's the worst that happens if you've sort of done your homework a little bit, is you have an interesting experience that doesn't quite work out and you just shift gears. So to me, it all comes back to, I think, what you first asked, which is the power of positive thinking in your life and also the people that you surround yourself with. I've been really fortunate with parents and friends and mentors, people that gave me a chance. But yeah, I hope that my story serves for kids all over the country and says, chase your dream, and it's okay. Put your hand up when someone says, I need a volunteer or whatever. Be willing to do it. Step out of your comfort zone and don't care so much what other people think or what other people might write on social media.
I read a really cool quote yesterday from Sir Richard Branson, and it said, when given an opportunity, say yes, even if you're not ready, and then figure out how to do it.
Yeah, and I think that you too, when you think back, because you've done a lot more entrepreneurial stuff than really I have. I've always been kind of in a corporate world. I'm doing some more entrepreneurial things now, but I think that Sir Richard is great. And boy, talk about someone who's just created a brand out of nothing that
Yes.
that really has become means something to people all over the world. I think his advice is dead on.
Yeah, he's obviously done that. One of the things that life hasn't always been, I hear people like I'll put myself in a category that have enjoyed some success. My father, Richard Branson, I watched his documentary recently. He has had multiple failures. There's been times where I've lost positivity. When I had 3 hip replacements and back surgery, I didn't have that hope that you talked about in your Miami speech. I lost that hope, and I know what that feels like. And when I didn't think I could walk normally again or jog again, guess what? It was self-fulfilling. I couldn't. But then when I started believing, okay, I'm going to have little wins every day, and I'm going to walk from my bed to the kitchen, and then I'm going to walk from my bed to the car, and from my bed to through the neighborhood, and from my bed to further than the neighborhood. When I started believing I could, I could. When I believed I couldn't, I couldn't. And it's amazing that we are our biggest barrier or the thing that makes us become what we become. And I do believe that there's something much greater than us that has a much bigger role than we believe that plays in that. But we do have to do the footwork. Have you had a time where you lost hope, and how did you deal with it?
Well, yeah, and I think that does lead probably into, and I don't know about losing hope. We'll talk about that on the plane crash, but I think you hit something that's so important for everyone. And there's an old sort of Chinese adage, which is the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And just what you did, that getting that first step is 100% more than what you did yesterday. And so, but it gives you a foundation to build on. And the other thing that you hit on, which is failure, I always think about this corporately. I've been in jobs that, didn't work out the way that I wanted to, or I needed to move on or whatever. That's just part of resilience and part of life. But think about this. So remember, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They took his company away from him. Now, one of the greatest comebacks in the history of business, for sure. They literally said, no, you can't run what you created anymore, okay? And so he was fired, out of work. And the other person, which people forget about a lot, is Jamie Dimon was fired. Sandy Weil fired him from Citibank. And he left and went to a Midwest bank, did really well, came back, and obviously is sort of the king of our finance world on Wall Street today. So I think that you can use those. There are a million sports metaphors, but I think sometimes it's good to see that even in business and people that we all put up on a pedestal, they were part of the school of hard knocks. And what it is resilience, believing in yourself, dusting yourself off, surrounding yourself with people that do support you and are willing. And I think you and I, Gary, absolutely believe that there's a much higher power that sort of guides us and is willing, when we ask, is willing to sort of help us.
Billy, man, I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I can't wait to talk about what happened to you on that fateful day in 2009, but we have to stop here. Coming up in the second part of my talk with Billy Campbell, one of the survivors of the miracle on the Hudson, Billy shares what he thought when he first heard Captain Sully announce, "Prepare for impact."
And so when he said that, we had 59 seconds before we were going to hit the water in the Hudson River. So a lot went through my mind. And the first one was, God, it's been a great 49 years. If you're ready for me, then I'm ready. However, if you're open to it, I'd really love another 49 years.
To learn and practice the Success Paradox lifestyle, visit GaryCCooper.com. The Success Paradox is a production of Forbes Books.